Okay, thank you very much for watching this video. My name is Woestmann, and within the next 10 minutes or so, I would like to present to you the results of a recent study we published in the Journal of Neuroscience, and the title of the paper is Alpha Oscillations in the Human Brain Implement Distractor Suppression Independent of Target Selection. So what's the general idea of the study? I try to visualize that on this slide. So consider this visual scenery, and if you get the task instruction to attend to the bird, you will probably find the bird over here. And the mental representation of the bird will increase relative to the background. But there are two different ways of how selective attention might accomplish this task. And the first mechanism is target enhancement. So as you can see here, the target, the bird, is enhanced, but the processing of the background of all the distractors is unchanged. The alternative mechanism would be distractor suppression. So here you can see that processing of the bird is unchanged. However, all the distractors in the background are suppressed. And maybe the human brain implements both of these mechanisms, target enhancement and distractor suppression, at the same time. But in this case, the question would be how these two mechanisms relate to each other. In order to study that, we recorded an EEG, so an electroencephalography experiment, as you can see here. In previous studies, we have used MEG for similar purposes. The general idea and analysis pipeline is very similar. We record the EEG signal over a number of experimental trials, and in these EEG signals you can see more or less rhythmic fluctuations in the signal. And to quantify them, we perform time-frequency decomposition of the single trial EEG data. We average across a number of trials in order to increase the signal-to-noise ratio. And then we can focus on particular frequency bands of interest. So for here, for example, the alpha frequency band from 8 to 12 Hertz. And we can visualize on a topographic map where this oscillatory energy is strongest. And this, for the alpha frequency band, this is typically the case over these occipitoparital electrode sites. And we can also perform a source localization, which also shows that these alpha oscillations are pretty strong over occipital electrodes. And these are data from an experiment where participants close their eyes, where we would expect that alpha power increases in occipital cortex regions. Interestingly, several previous studies have shown that alpha oscillations are tightly related to attention. For example, it has been shown that during auditory attention, alpha power increases in occipitoparital cortex regions compared to visual attention. Temporal attention is also indicated by alpha oscillations. So in this study, participants first had to ignore and later to attend a visual stimulus, and alpha power was first high and later low. And when the authors then reversed the order of attending and ignoring, also the order of high and low alpha power reversed. In a spatial attention study, we have shown previously that alpha power lateralizes across the two hemispheres. So when we compare attention to the left versus right side in an auditory experiment, alpha power increases in the hemisphere ipsilateral and decreases in the hemisphere contralateral to the to-be-attended auditory signal. And finally, here's an example from an ECOG study, which shows that alpha power very selectively decreases in auditory cortex regions during an auditory task, and it increases in pretty much all of the remaining cortex regions. So this is very much in line with the general idea that high alpha power in cortical regions which are task irrelevant reflects the inhibition or the suppression of this task irrelevant neural processing. So there is one problem with these previous studies on alpha oscillations and selective attention, namely that most of these studies actually confound target enhancement and distractor suppression. And actually we also have this confound in our previous studies. So here's an example where we used a dichotic listening experiment and presented target signals on one ear and distractors on the other ear. And we had two experimental conditions, select left and select right. However, whenever the target appeared on the left, the distractor appeared on the right side and vice versa. So this means that target and distractor presentation are completely confounded, and alpha power lateralization that we observe in these experimental paradigms cannot unambiguously be assigned to either target enhancement or distractor suppression. So maybe this alpha power lateralization reflects target enhancement, maybe it reflects distractor suppression, maybe it reflects both. We don't know. And in the visual modality, other studies have done the same. So here's an example where participants were attending to visual objects, and whenever the target object was on the left, the distractor was on the right, and vice versa. Also, they observed nice hemispheric lateralization of alpha power. However, again, it is unclear whether this lateralization of alpha power reflects target enhancement or distractor suppression, or both. So what can we do? Well, we can design a new experimental paradigm to decouple distractor suppression and target enhancement, and this is what we did. And we also pre-registered this study at the Open Science Framework. So if you are interested in the pre-registration of all of the experimental hypotheses and the analysis pipeline, you can look that up here on the OSF. Here's the general trial structure of the experimental paradigm that we used. It was an auditory experiment, a pitch discrimination task. And on each trial, participants were presented with two auditory stimuli. One stimulus was presented on a to-be-attended loudspeaker and the other on a to-be-ignored loudspeaker, so a distracting loudspeaker. And on each trial, first a spatial cue was presented on the target loudspeaker. This was just a broadband noise to indicate that this is the target loudspeaker. And a little later, there was a tone sequence of two tones presented on this target loudspeaker, while a distracting tone sequence was presented on the other loudspeaker, which was a bit higher in frequency in general. And participants had the task to indicate whether the target sequence was increasing or decreasing in pitch. And participants had 4 buttons to indicate that, because they could also indicate their confidence in the decision. So low confidence could be indicated by the inner buttons and high confidence by these outer buttons. And the hemispheric lateralization of alpha power that I will show later was analyzed in this time interval, starting at the beginning of the spatial cue and ending before the presentation of these competing tone sequences. So this paradigm basically allows us to decouple target selection and distractor suppression because of the way how we presented or how we placed the target and the distractor loudspeaker in this study. So in order to study target selection independent of distractor suppression, we kept the distractor fixed in front of the participants in a blockwise fashion. So this means that we contrasted trials where the distractor was fixed in the front and the target was placed on the left, with trials where the distractor was fixed in the front but the target was placed on the right side of the participants. So the target loudspeaker was 90 degrees to the right side. And then we can compare, contrast, select left and select right trials, and any difference in the hemispheric lateralization of alpha power would be driven by target selection, because this is manipulated between the two experimental conditions, but not by distractor suppression, because the distracting stimulus is kept constant in these two conditions. So here you see the contrast of select left versus select right trials divided by the sum of the two. And as it is common for this hemispheric lateralization of alpha power, we see relatively enhanced alpha power on the hemisphere ipsilateral to the target and relatively reduced, decreased alpha power on the contralateral hemisphere. And you can see that this is a very consistent effect across participants when we contrast the two hemispheres here over these electrodes of interest. And a source localization shows that this effect is strongest in parieto-occipital cortex regions. So alpha oscillations, or the hemispheric lateralization of alpha oscillations, seems to implement target selection. The question is, does it also implement distractor suppression? So in order to study that, we simply reversed the experimental paradigm and divided the trials in suppress left and suppress right trials. So in suppress left trials, the target was fixed in the front, but the distractor was on the right side. And in suppress right trials, the target was again in the front, but the distractor was on the right side. So in these conditions, any effect on alpha power lateralization would be driven by distractor placement, because this changed across the conditions, whereas target placement was kept constant. And interestingly, when we calculate alpha power lateralization for the contrast, suppress left versus suppress right, we found that the hemispheric lateralization of alpha power was reversed compared to target selection. The effect was in general a bit smaller, as you can see here, a bit smaller and less consistent across subjects, but statistically significant. And you can also see that the source localization seems to suggest the effect to happen a bit more anterior than target selection. So target selection is a bit more prominent in the posterior occipitoparietal cortex regions, whereas distractor suppression happens to occur a bit more anterior. So as we have seen on the previous slide, we basically found two mechanisms that are implemented by the hemispheric lateralization of alpha power, target selection and distractor suppression. And a subsequent question to us was, how do these two mechanisms relate to each other? So the general idea is, if there is a single cognitive faculty, attentional control, which would implement both of these mechanisms, then they should be related to each other. A participant who exhibits strong target selection should also be a participant who exhibits strong distractor suppression. However, this was not the case. So in this scatter plot, you simply see target selection plotted against distractor suppression. So that's the alpha lateralization at left versus right hemispheric electrodes. And as you can see, there is no significant relation between these two mechanisms. So they are not directly related to one another. And here you can see an additional way to analyze the overlap or the spatial similarity, topographic similarity between target selection and distractor suppression. So we contrasted these two effects on the source level, and the pink regions indicate those areas where target selection was significantly stronger than distractor suppression, and that was the case in these more occipitoparietal, more posterior regions. However, these blue regions indicate those areas where suppression was stronger than selection, and this was, as we saw on the previous slide, more anterior, right? In these more anterior temporal and parietal cortex regions. So these results indicate that distractor suppression and target selection, as implemented by alpha oscillations, are to a large extent independent of one another. So to summarize the results of the present study in terms of this visual depiction of the motivation for the study, we found that alpha oscillations implement two mechanisms of selective attention. They both implement target enhancement and distractor suppression. However, at present there is no evidence for a direct relationship between the two, so they really seem to be largely independent neural mechanisms. What else to find in the paper? So why should you read the whole paper and not only watch this short presentation? In the paper you find a control analysis for saccadic eye movements, which is important for all of these spatial attention studies where saccadic eye movements might affect the results. So we present a control analysis for this in the paper. You find a detailed analysis of behavioral results, which I did not present in this video. But of course, we collected behavioral data and analyzed them in detail, which is presented in the paper. You will find reliability analysis of lateralized alpha responses. This is also something I consider very important. So before entering alpha lateralization for target selection and distractor suppression into a correlation analysis, it's very important to make sure that these two are reliable measures in the first place. And this is demonstrated in the paper. And also we show that there's a single trial brain behavior relationship. So basically single trial hemispheric lateralization of alpha power is significantly related to single trial behavior performance. It's not a very strong effect, but it's statistically significant, and it's in the predicted direction. If you are interested in this paper, you can also find a preprint of this paper on the bioRxiv. And finally, I would like to thank you very much for watching this video, for your attention, in the name of the research group Auditory Cognition at the University of Lübeck.